The Fiat CR.42 Falco may have been the best biplane fighter still flying combat in 1940. That was already the problem. More than 1,800 were built. It became the most numerous Italian fighter of the war. And it even went to Belgium with the Corpo Aereo Italiano, part of an expeditionary force of some 200 aircraft. Then, 11 November 1940 exposed the limit. On Italy's only major daylight raid of the Battle of Britain, the Harwich strike was intercepted by hurricanes. The Italians took heavy losses, and similar daylight raids were not repeated. The CR.42 could still turn tightly and punish careless opponents. It could not change the fact that Italy was sending a frontline biplane into a monoplane war. The Fiat G50 Freccia moved Italy into the monoplane age, but not far enough. It entered service in 1938 as Italy's first single-seat, all-metal monoplane fighter with retractable landing gear, and roughly 780 were built. On paper, that looked like modernization. In combat, it carried the weaknesses of a first-generation answer. Many operational aircraft had open cockpits, the range was short, the speed margin was thin, and the type was badly suited to the cold and weather over the Channel. The Battle of Britain made that obvious, and after 1941, the G50 slipped into a minor role. Italy had finally stepped out of the biplane era. Its first modern fighter still arrived below the level the war was demanding. The WWII Falco one looked closer to the future than either of those fighters, and Italy still did not make it the answer. The prototype flew on 24 May 1939. About 186 were built, and test flying showed the aircraft could perform extremely well. Then the Air Ministry turned cold. The wing tanks were seen as too vulnerable and too prone to leaks, and the production path lost momentum. Only 5 Serie 1 aircraft initially served in the Regia Aeronautica, with only small additional numbers following, while the type found more life in exports, and even as catapult fighters on Italian capital ships. That left the WWII with one of the strangest reputations in the war, a fighter that looked more promising than its place in service, and then spent most of its career on the edges of its own air force. The Breda Ba.65 was still being asked to fight after its time had already started running out. The production record itself is messy. The Italian Air Force history page gives 265 built, while other standard summaries list 218. The operational picture is clearer. More than 150 were still in service when Italy entered the war in June 1940, and they were pushed into the North African fight against British fighters that were already exposing every weakness in the type. Losses mounted fast, and by October 1941, an Italian study judged the aircraft to have no value as a combat type. The Ba.65 had been the main dedicated Italian attack aircraft. In the real desert war, it turned into a machine that was surviving on inertia rather than relevance. The Breda Ba.88 Lince went from record-setting showpiece to airfield decoy in a matter of months. The prototype line broke speed records. 149 were built, and the aircraft looked like the kind of twin-engine strike machine fascist Italy wanted to parade. Then the production version took on weapons, armor, radios, and operational equipment, and the performance collapsed. In North Africa, the type struggled even to get airborne under real combat loads. By mid-November 1940, most surviving Ba.88s had already been stripped of useful equipment and scattered around airfields as decoys. That is one of the ugliest endings on this list. The Ba.88 was sold to the public as a modern answer. In combat, it became a warning about how fast a sleek prototype could die once the war weight arrived. The IMAM Ro.57bis arrived with the wrong roll, the wrong speed, and the wrong date. The original IMAM Ro.57 first flew in 1939 and had the makings of a long-range twin-engine interceptor with a top speed around 516 kilometers per hour. Then the design was pushed toward the dive bomber role. The Ro.57bis lost speed, dropping to about 466 kilometers per hour, and production slipped until 1943. About 200 were ordered, but only around 50 to 60 were delivered. That left the aircraft stranded between categories. It was too late to strengthen Italian air defense, too lightly armed to justify its cost, and too compromised by role changes to become a serious strike solution. The Ro.57bis is what happens when a force cannot decide what a new aircraft is supposed to be until the war has already moved on. The Fiat BR-20 Cicogna looked modern enough before the war and ordinary enough once the war exposed it. The Regia Aeronautica bought more than 500, and in June 1940, it was still Italy's standard medium bomber, even though it was already nearing obsolescence. Its most public embarrassment came over Britain. On 11 November 1940, 12 BR-20s headed for Harwich on Italy's only major daylight raid of the Battle of Britain. Hurricanes broke into the formation. The Italians took heavy losses, and daylight repetition stopped there. By 1942, the BR-20 had slipped mostly into maritime patrol and training duties. That is why it belongs here. It was not a useless bomber. It was the standard bomber of a country whose standard had already fallen behind the real war. The CANT Z-1007 Alcione is the aircraft that traps people into saying Italy had the answer after all. It is often described as the best Italian bomber of the war, and there is enough truth in that to understand the reputation. About 660 were built. It had good flying qualities, and it served from the Mediterranean and Greece to North Africa and the Eastern Front. The problem is what that compliment actually means. Being the best Italian bomber of the war is not the same thing as solving the bombing problem. The Z-1007's wooden structure drew recurring criticism over durability in harsh climates, especially in North Africa and Russia, and production never turned it into a war-winning force. It ended up as the aircraft Italians praised most and the aircraft that still did not fix the system around it. The Savoia-Marchetti SM.84 was supposed to replace the Savoia-Marchetti SM.79 Sparviero. It ended up retiring before the aircraft it was built to replace. First flown on 5 June 1940 and introduced in 1941, the type reached 329 built, yet never fully displaced the older bomber. The combat math showed the problem early. During Operation Halberd on 27 September 1941, 12 SM-84s attacked the convoy, damaged HMS Nelson, and still paid for it with 6 aircraft lost. Public criticism and crew criticism followed the aircraft through the rest of its service, especially over handling and takeoff behavior. The SM-84 had more power and newer lines. It never won enough trust to become the real successor. In Italian service, that is replacement failure in its cleanest form. Italy's wartime aircraft story kept breaking on the same pattern. Old types stayed too long, new types arrived half-right, and replacement programs missed their targets. France failed in a different order, so click the next video and watch how French fighters, attackers, and bombers collapsed through timing, doctrine, and a very different kind of wartime failure.